Hi, this is Selena Tulip, and in this video I'm going to show you some tips and techniques for doing input validation when you are doing GUI form building using Java, and in particular I'll be using the Netbeans GUI builder. So to get started, let's look at a really bad example. This is an input form that asks for a bunch of information: person's name, whether or not they're a citizen or resident, their gender, date of birth, how much they want to contribute, maybe it's for a political party, and what state they're from. So we can run this and have a look at how it works. When it comes up, I can type information in. I can say that I'm a citizen. I can put in that I'm a man. I can just type in gobbledygook for the date of birth. I can put in a negative number here for the contribution amount, and I can put in gobbledygook for the state and submit. And if you see down here and you look at the output, it just takes all this information and treats it as if it's totally fine. And of course, none of this information is really works. It's not what we want. So let's take a look at the code that runs this. So if we go over to the source code, what we see is down at the very bottom, we have a bunch of private variables that I've added here to store the information, like state, contribution, the different parts of the date, whether or not someone is male, whether or not they're a citizen, their name, and so on. And if we look at, we have a cancel button, which just closes the window, but the main work for this type of form is always done in the method for the submit button. So here we have the submit button action performed, and we can see that we're getting the name, and in fact that worked because we did get the gobbledygook that I typed in, and then we're checking the gender text field, and so here we're seeing, is it male, and we're using the equals ignores case on the string. So gender text field, we get the text that returns a string, and on a string item we can call equals ignores case and pass it a new string, and it will say it'll be either true if someone typed male or capital M male, or otherwise it'll set it to false. The citizen text field, we basically assume somebody was going to type either yes or no. So again, if they type yes, we're setting it to true. Otherwise, we're setting it to false. And then we're printing stuff out. For the contribution, we're calling this parse int. So it's a static method on the integer class, and we're saying we're going to pass you a string. So we're calling getText on the contribution text field. We're passing it to this parse int method, and it's going to try to make a number out of it and put it in contribution. And you can see that it actually did that because we typed in -800, and it stored -800 in our contribution field. Then we get the state, and again, we just allow someone to type in text. So we got a gobbledygook state, and so on. And then we just print out all this information. So these print statements are what you see down here. And that's pretty much all that's happening in this form, and it's really actually a pretty terrible form. So I'm going to close it down, and we're going to run it again, and I want to show you, in fact, how terrible it is. So again, I can type a real name. I'll type my name. I can type citizen to say that I'm a citizen, because this question, well, you could sort of answer it in lots of ways. You could say yes, you could say no, you could say citizen, you could say green card, what have you. Gender, I'm going to say that I'm a lady. Date of birth, I'm going to say that I was born January 50th, which doesn't make any sense, in the year 3000, which again doesn't make any sense. And I'm just going to put some gobbledygook here for my contribution amount. And I'm going to put Canada for the state. Actually, no, I won't put that in. I'll put an actual number in. Put 900. And I'm going to submit. So it says Selena's not a citizen, but I said I was a citizen, but it's because I didn't say yes. It says I'm female. Well, lady, I think that's just because male false is the default. Date of birth is, it couldn't get my date of birth. I have contributed $900, that it got that, and it says I live in Canada, but of course Canada isn't really a state. So let's try this actually one more time. We'll run it one more because I want to show you what happens with the number. I'm going to run it again. I'm not even going to fill out any of this stuff, but I'm going to put gobbledygook in here in the contribution amount and submit that, and you'll see that actually it causes my program to crash. And that's because the parse int method is trying to take these letters and turn them into a number, and it can't. And I haven't handled that. So it's throwing an exception, and you can see down here, Java Lang number format exception, and I haven't put a try catch around there to handle that exception, handle that error. Anyways, and this form in general is just not telling me when I haven't put in information that is necessary. So that's bad input validation. Now, let's look at an example of better input validation. So we'll go over here, open this one, and this is the file we want. You can see here that I've designed a form where the GUI elements, the widgets that I've chosen, are much more suitable to take in the information that I need. So in this case, I do still have a text field for entering the name, and I'm providing some text here to start off with to help them know what they're supposed to do. To find out whether they're a citizen or permanent resident, I have a checkbox, so they're either going to check that or not. There's no yes, citizen, maybe, green card, none of this stuff that I have to then figure out what they've said. For gender, I've just given them a radio button, male or female, so they have to choose one or the other. For date of birth, I've separated it into parsable numeric fields. So these are actually just text fields, but they're going to enter things that I can, because they're separate boxes, I'll know that this part is meant to be the month, and this part is meant to be the day, and this part is meant to be the year. So I can easily detect which should be which, because there's 30 million different ways that a person could type in a date if you just give them a text field. They might type in, January 5th, 1923, or they might type in January 5, 23. They might type in 5 January 23. I mean, there's just so many things, and you don't want to have to contend with that. So splitting it out into the separate parts will make your life a lot easier. And also, this really tells the user and helps the user to know, okay, as long as I put the month and the day and the year in here, this form is going to correctly parse my data. Again, here for the dollar amount, I'm telling them that they have to enter a dollar amount. And then for the state, I've actually got a drop down. So what I want to show you is a few specific things that I've added into this form to make it more usable. So first of all, this text box, I've entered some text, but I've also added an event. And the event that I've added, so if you click down here on the events, if you look down here, I added a mouse clicked event, JName text field mouse clicked. And if we go to that source code, you'll see here that what I did was I set the text to the empty string. So when they click in there, they don't actually have to erase the enter text. It's going to be erased for them, and they can start typing. So that makes it easier for them. All right. And I've done the same thing for all of the other text fields here. Now for the state, I actually added in my source code at the very bottom, I added an array of strings that has all the states in it. So you can see here, it doesn't actually have all of them, but I typed in a bunch of them. And if we look at the properties for this drop-down box, you'll see that there's this model property. It says right here user code, and I'll show you what I did here. It's a custom code, and I said set the model to be a new Java X Swing default combo box model, and I'm calling a getStates method, which returns my states array. That enables the form to actually get all those states and populate the combo box for me, and I don't have to retype them in here myself. So that's just to give you a sense of how that works. I've also added a reset button, and the reset button will reset all these values. It'll put the enter name back in, put MM and DD back in, etc. Okay, so let's first run this just to see what it looks like. The other thing you'll notice is that I've added, when I run it, you'll see that I've added a whole bunch of dialog boxes if data is not entered correctly. So let's run this. Oh, and I also added some color. I'll show you how to do that in the code. So here you can see that when I click in this box, that string disappears, so I can type my name. I can check or uncheck this. I can check the male versus female, and I will show you how these radio buttons get grouped together because that's important. In here, I can enter my month, so I'll say January, and I'll say January 1st, and I will say, I'm going to say something crazy. I'm going to say the year 5000 and see what it tells me. I'm going to leave the contribution amount blank. I'm going to say, I don't want to contribute. And you can see here, here's all my states, so I'll say North Carolina, and I'm going to submit this. Now, I'm getting some feedback here. This says not a valid birth year, and it says contribution field is empty. So I'm getting an error message. It says incomplete, invalid data entered, and I click OK. So now I can go back and I can say, oh, that was supposed to be 1970, and let's put in a contribution amount. I'm going to be tricky. I'm going to contribute a negative amount. I'm going to contribute 300. I'll say submit, and it says no, amount must be a positive number. Oh, okay, well fine, I'll make it a positive number. Now I'm going to say 300, and I'm going to say 350 cents. And I'm going to say submit, and it's going to say contribution is not a valid number. That's maybe not the best message, but what it should maybe say is contribution must be a whole number. So if I go back and I get rid of the .50 and I say 300, then I can submit this. It got all valid values, and it says all is good. Values are, the name is Celine. Celine is not a citizen. I guess I didn't check the box. Celine is male. I guess I didn't change that radio button. And it got my date of birth that I put in, which is not my real date of birth, by the way, how much I contributed, and where I live. So let's take a look at the source code so you can see how this is all done. So at the bottom, we have these states. Here's my little method that returns the string array of states. And I have the same set of private variables to hold the information that I need to collect. Here's my reset method code. So when you click on the reset button, it's just resetting those values. And there's a bunch of stuff here that these are the things to set the text fields to blank when you click on them, so you can type what you want to type. But here is this gigantic long method that is for the submit button. So there's a lot of code in here, and I'm not going to go through every line of this, but I'll go through just a couple of examples. So the first thing that I did was I created a num fields final constant 7 because there's 7 pieces of information I need to collect. And then I put the number of correct fields, and I started off at 0 and say, until I've checked all the data, I'm going to assume none of the data is there. As I go through and check each piece of information, I'm going to add to this, and at the end, I'll see if I've got 7 correct fields, so I'll compare these two numbers. I'm also creating an empty string error message, and that allows me to add bits of information to an error message that can be printed out as I go through and look at all this data. So the first one I'm going to check is the name. So I look at the JName text field, which is the name of the text field, and I get the text, which returns a string, and then again I do equals, ignore case. I check to see if it's still enter name, because if it is, that's a problem, or I check to see if it's empty. Either one of those are problems, and here then I use the error message. This is the string up here that I created. I call concatenate on it, which adds something to it, and this returns the new string, which is the old string plus stuff added to it. And so error message, this is kind of like x equals x plus 5, except it's the string equals the string plus this new part. So in this case, I said name field is missing. Now, if neither of those things is true, then that means that there's some text in this, which is good. And in this case, I increment my num correct field, so now it'll be 1. And then I actually store that text in my name variable, which I define below. Now, down here, I can see if the citizen checkbox is selected. And that's going to return either true or false. So I'm just storing this in citizen res, which is a Boolean variable that I created. Gender. For gender, I've got 2 radio buttons, JRadio button male, JRadio button female. And if I say if either of them is selected, then my number of correct fields goes up. And I just assign to the male Boolean variable whether or not the male is selected, because only one of them can be. So if the male is selected, then male is true, otherwise male will be false, and so I'll know what the gender is. And again, if neither of them happens to be selected somehow, which shouldn't ever happen, but just in case somehow something gets messed up, I've got an error message that I can add. Gender has not been selected. Now, let's look at one more example because the numbers are slightly more complicated. So let's look at the month example. The first thing I do is check to make sure that it's not empty. So I check to see, is it still just MM or is it empty? If either of those two things is true, then I concatenate my error message and I'm not incrementing the number of valid fields that I have. If neither of those things is true, then that means that there's something in the date field. So now what I want to do is I want to try to convert the text in the month field to an integer. So I call integer.parseInt, and I pass in whatever's in the month text field. And if I get a number out, it's going to get stored in MM. If this throws an exception, because it's not an actual number, none of this stuff will get executed, and we'll come down to this catch, and we'll print out this, we'll add this to the error message, month is not a valid number. If it turns out that we did get a valid number, then we have to do the logical check. Now we have to say, well, is month less than 0 or equal to 0, or is it greater than 12? Because if that's the case, that's not a valid month. So then we add that error. If it's a number and it's between 0 and up to and including 12, then we have a good number. We assign it to our place where we want to store it, and we increment our num-correct fields. So we do the same type of process for the day. We do the same type of process for the year, checking the valid range. One thing that you'll note in here is that I have not really done a good job of checking the date based on which month we're in. So I haven't taken care of the dependency. So for example, if the month is 2 for February, then really we should be checking whether day is greater than 28 or 29. And I haven't handled that. So this code isn't perfect, but it's a lot better. So there's the year, and then we have the contribution field. For contribution, we want to make sure that the amount is positive. And then we have the state. So just want to look at this last one to see how you get information out of the state. We call getSelectedItem, and we convert it to the string. And then we check to see if it's empty. This probably can't actually happen. Otherwise, we actually just assign the getSelectedItem, converting it to a string, to our string state variable, and again, increment our num-correct fields. Finally, at the end of this, I see, have I got the right number of correct fields? If the number of correct fields I found is less than the num fields I'm expecting, then I'm going to show this dialog box. So J option pane, show message dialog. The null just says, just throw it up. It's based on this window. Error message is what I've been adding up here. That's this error message. This string right here is the title of the dialog box. And this option here just says show the red error icon. If I do have the right number of fields, then I do all this system printing out to the console, which is what you see down here. Now, two last things I want to show you. Way up at the top, in the input form constructor for this frame, we call init components. That's the thing that builds this whole stuff. That's the code that's usually hidden that you can expand if you want to see it. This line right here, I call this.getContentPane, and I set the background. That's how I got the form to be that cyan blue color. And the last thing I want to show you is in the design, these radio buttons. So JRadio button male, JRadio button female, and what I actually have is also a J button group called gender. Now that's not something that shows up visibly, but when you click on it, you'll see that these two things have been added to that button group. And the way that I did that was when you click on JRadio, one of these radio buttons, you can look over on the properties and you can see that there's a button group property. So I first had to create the button group by dragging it onto the frame, and I gave it a name, and then once inside these buttons, I can say it's the J button group gender. That's the button group it belongs to. And that's how the form knows that when you click on male, you've got to unclick female, etc. So That's input validation using GUI forms and the type of code that you need to write in the background to make this all work in a way that's going to be helpful to your user. Okay, so this code will be posted and available for you to look at in detail and play around with.